The story of Lenin's philosophy does not begin with a single moment of revelation, but with a long, restless conversation that stretched across continents and generations. To understand the intellectual climate that Lenin inherited, we must first travel back to the bustling cafes of late 19th century Europe, where the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, the clatter of printing presses, and the fevered debates of thinkers who believed that the world could be understood and ultimately reshaped through reason. It was in that crucible of ideas that dialectical materialism first took shape, a doctrine that would become the backbone of Lenin's own political theory. Karl Marx, writing in the 1840s, set out to overturn the dominant metaphysical explanations of his day. He argued that the material conditions of life, what people produce, how they produce it, and how the fruits of production are distributed, were the true engine of historical change. In the famous preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx declares, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." This inversion of the idealist tradition placed the economic base at the center of history, and it was this base that he believed generated the superstructure of law, politics, and ideology. For Marx, history was not a linear march toward progress, but a dialectical process, an ongoing conflict of opposites that resolves into a higher synthesis. The clash between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, he argued, would inevitably produce a revolutionary rupture, a moment when the old order could no longer contain the contradictions it had generated. Friedrich Engels, Marx's lifelong collaborator, sharpened the focus on the working class. In The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels catalogued the misery of factory labor, the squalid living conditions, and the systematic exploitation that turned human beings into mere cogs in the machinery of capital. He wrote, "The proletariat, the class that sells its labor power, is the only class that is capable of destroying the capitalist system, because it is the only class that does not own any means of production." Engels thus provided the ethical urgency to Marx's structural analysis. The proletariat was not merely a passive subject of history, but an active agent capable of overturning the entire system. Yet Marx and Engels did not develop their ideas in a vacuum. Their dialectical method was itself a response to the legacy of German idealism, particularly the work of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel taught that reality unfolds through a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, a movement of concepts that gradually reveal the absolute spirit. Marx famously turned Hegel on his head, proclaiming that the Hegelian dialectic is a method of understanding the world, but it is a materialist method, not an idealist one. By stripping Hegel's dialectic of its metaphysical gloss and grounding it in concrete economic relations, Marx and Engels produced a tool that could be applied to the material conditions of any society. When these ideas filtered eastward, they encountered a very different set of circumstances. Russia at the turn of the century was a vast empire, still largely agrarian, ruled by an autocratic czar, and riddled with a complex web of serfdoms, lingering vestiges, industrial pockets, and a burgeoning intelligentsia. The Russian intelligentsia, eager to understand the forces shaping their world, turned to the works of Marx, but they also needed a bridge, a translation of abstract theory into the language of Russian experience. That bridge was built by thinkers such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky and Georgy Plekhanov. Chernyshevsky, a novelist and revolutionary Democrat, introduced the idea of the new man in his novel, What Is to Be Done, published in 1863. He imagined a rational, self-directed individual who would break free from the shackles of oppression through scientific knowledge and collective action. Though Chernyshevsky was not a Marxist in the strict sense, his emphasis on rational self-development and his critique of autocracy resonated with the younger generation of Russian radicals. He famously wrote, "The future belongs to those who can think for themselves." In the salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow, his ideas sparked a fervent discussion about how to apply the European critique of capitalism to the Russian context. Georgy Plekhanov, often called the father of Russian Marxism, took the next step. He translated Marx's major works into Russian, wrote extensive commentaries, and argued that the Russian Revolution must be rooted in the development of the capitalist mode of production, however embryonic it seemed. In his 1885 essay, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, Plekhanov asserted, "Even in a country where the peasantry dominates, the emergence of a proletariat is inevitable. Because the forces of capital cannot be halted indefinitely, Plekhanov's insistence on a scientific, materialist analysis provided the intellectual scaffolding upon which Lenin would later construct his own revolutionary program." It is here that we encounter the first concrete example of how historical events shaped Lenin's theoretical evolution, the the 1905 Revolution. In the wake of Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, a wave of popular unrest swept across the empire. Strikes erupted in the industrial centers of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Peasants seized land, and a spontaneous workers' council, known as the Soviet, was formed in St. Petersburg. For a brief moment, the Tsarist regime seemed on the brink of collapse. Lenin, then a young agitator living in exile in Switzerland, observed these events with a mixture of excitement and critical distance. He wrote in a letter to his comrades, "The revolution of 1905 showed us the strength of the masses, but also their weakness when they lack a disciplined, revolutionary party to guide them." He concluded that the revolution's failure lay not in the lack of popular discontent, but in the absence of a cohesive, centralized organization that could seize the moment and transform spontaneous protest into a sustained seizure of state power. Lenin's analysis of the 1905 uprising introduced the concept of the weakest link in revolutionary strategy. He argued that the revolutionary movement could not rely on any single class or group. Rather, it must identify the point in the existing power structure that was most vulnerable to rupture. In his 1905 pamphlet, What is to be Done, a title that deliberately echoed Chernyshevsky's earlier work, Lenin argued that the proletariat, organized under a vanguard party, could become that weakest link. He wrote, "The party must become the conscious, systematic, and disciplined embodiment of the working class's revolutionary potential." This pamphlet, with its clear call for a professional revolutionary cadre, marked a decisive departure from the more spontaneous, mass-based approaches that had characterized earlier Russian radicalism. The second concrete example comes from the February uprising of 1917, a moment that forced Lenin to revisit and revise his theoretical assumptions. In February, the war-weary soldiers, factory workers, and disillusioned middle-class citizens flooded the streets of Petrograd, demanding bread, peace, and an end to autocracy. The Tsar abdicated and a provisional government took power. Yet the provisional government was weak, indecisive, and increasingly alienated from the very masses that had toppled it. Lenin, who was still in exile in Switzerland, received a sealed telegram from the German authorities, an attempt to persuade him to stay put. In his famous April Theses, Lenin dismissed the provisional government as a bourgeois facade and called for all power to the Soviets. He argued that the revolutionary potential now lay not in the provisional government but in the Soviets themselves, which could serve as the organs of a new proletarian state. Lenin's response to February demonstrated a crucial theoretical shift. While the 1905 revolution had taught him that a disciplined party could guide an uprising, the events of 1917 showed him that the party must also be prepared to seize power when the existing state apparatus collapses, however briefly. He wrote, "The revolution is not a single event, it is a process, a chain of ruptures, each one creating new possibilities for the next." This insight would later be elaborated in his writings on the dictatorship of the proletariat, where he argued that the party must not only lead the revolution, but also maintain the revolutionary momentum through a transitional state that suppresses counter-revolutionary forces. To bring these abstract ideas into sharper relief, let us consider two vivid anecdotes from Lenin's own life, moments that illuminate his intellectual journey. The first takes us back to the spring of 1902, when a young Lenin, then living in Geneva, obtained a copy of a little-known pamphlet titled The Development of Capitalism in Russia, authored by the German economist Werner Sombart. Lenin devoured the work, noting in his diary, "Sombart's analysis confirms what Plekhanov has long argued. Even in a country dominated by peasants, the forces of capital are already reshaping the social fabric." This encounter reinforced Lenin's conviction that Russia was not a static pre-capitalist society awaiting a unique path, but a nation already caught in the contradictions of capitalist development, however unevenly distributed. The realization that the capitalist mode was taking root in the Russian textile mills, the railways, and the burgeoning urban centers gave Lenin the materialist foundation he needed to argue that a proletarian revolution was not only possible but inevitable. The second anecdote occurs in the tumultuous year of 1905. While many of his comrades were still debating the merits of legalistic reform versus outright insurrection, Lenin took a decisive step. He authored the pamphlet What is to be Done, and in a bold move distributed it clandestinely among workers' circles in St. Petersburg. In a handwritten note attached to each copy, he urged, "Do not wait for the masses to become conscious on their own. Create a conscious vanguard that will illuminate the path." The pamphlet's impact was immediate. It sparked heated debates in factory meetings, forced other revolutionary groups to confront the question of organization, and perhaps most importantly, it solidified Lenin's reputation as a theorist willing to translate abstract Marxist concepts into concrete political strategy. The pamphlet's title, deliberately echoing Chernyshevsky, signaled a continuity with Russian revolutionary tradition, while its content marked a decisive break toward a more centralized, disciplined approach. These historical moments are not isolated footnotes. They form the connective tissue between Marx's broad critique of capitalism and Lenin's specific prescriptions for revolutionary action in Russia. Yet Lenin's synthesis has not gone unchallenged. Critics have raised two major counter-arguments that continue to animate scholarly debate. The first criticism asserts that Lenin merely copied Marx, that his theories are nothing more than a repackaging of 19th-century ideas with a Russian veneer. Detractors point to passages where Lenin echoes Marx verbatim, such as his frequent citation of the base superstructure model, and argue that Lenin's innovations are superficial. In response, scholars like Stephen Kotkin have emphasized that Lenin's contributions lie not in inventing new concepts, but in adapting Marx's dialectical materialism to a specific historical context. Kotkin notes Lenin's genius was in recognizing that the Russian Empire's semi-feudal structure required a different revolutionary subject, one that combined the industrial proletariat with the politically conscious peasantry, organized through a vanguard party. This adaptation required a nuanced understanding of Marx's theory of historical materialism and a willingness to modify it in light of empirical realities, something that Marx himself would have likely approved of, given his own emphasis on the necessity of grounding theory in concrete conditions. The second counter-argument comes from historians who contend that Russian conditions made Marxism inapplicable. They argue that Russia's economy was still overwhelmingly agrarian, that the proletariat constituted a tiny fraction of the population, and that the peasantry's interests diverged sharply from those of industrial workers. In their seminal work, The Russian Revolution, a counter-Marxist perspective, authors Richard Pipes and Hugh Seton would argue the Marxist blueprint assumes a mature capitalist economy. Russia in 1917 was still a pre-capitalist, semi-colonial periphery, making the direct transplantation of Marxist doctrine a misfit. Lenin, however, addressed this critique head-on in his 1915 work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He argued that imperialist exploitation had accelerated the development of capitalist relations in peripheral nations, turning them into semi-colonial societies where the contradictions of capitalism manifested in a compressed and intensified form. He wrote, "The imperialist war has turned the world into a single capitalist arena. The proletariat of the periphery, though numerically smaller, is no less revolutionary because its struggle is directly linked to the imperialist powers that dominate it." By framing Russia as a late developing capitalist caught in the grip of imperialism, Lenin provided a theoretical justification for applying Marxist analysis to a nation that, on the surface, seemed to lack the industrial proletariat Marx had envisioned. These debates are not merely academic. They have practical implications for how we understand the role of the party and the concept of the vanguard, topics that will be explored in later sections of this series. The idea that a disciplined, theoretically grounded party could act as the consciousness of the proletariat is rooted in Lenin's synthesis of Marx's materialist analysis and the concrete lessons of the 1905 and 1917 uprisings. In later discussions, we will see how Lenin's notion of the vanguard party, an organized, professional revolutionary cadre, served both as a corrective to the spontaneous, uncoordinated movements of 1905 and as a mechanism to harness the revolutionary potential of the Soviets after February 1917. To make these abstract arguments more tangible, let us turn to two concrete analogies that illustrate Lenin's strategic thinking. Imagine a river that has been dammed for centuries, its waters building pressure behind a concrete wall. The dam represents the autocratic state, the czarist bureaucracy, and the entrenched interests that maintain the status quo. The water behind the dam is the collective discontent of workers, peasants, and soldiers. If a small leak appears, perhaps a strike in a single factory or a mutiny among a regiment, that leak is the weakest link Lenin identified. Left unchecked, the pressure will find an outlet and the dam will burst, releasing a torrent that reshapes the landscape. Lenin's vanguard party in this analogy is the engineered breach that directs the flood toward a predetermined channel, ensuring that the water does not simply flood the surrounding fields but instead fills a new basin, a socialist state. This analogy captures both the inevitability of rupture, the pressure of class contradictions, and the necessity of strategic guidance, the party's role. A second analogy draws from the world of chess. In a typical game, the opening moves set the stage for the entire match. If a player makes a careless pawn move, the opponent can exploit that weakness to dominate the board. Lenin viewed the 1905 revolution as an opening move that revealed the vulnerabilities of the Tsarist regime. The pawn of the proletariat had advanced, exposing the king's limited mobility. However, without a coordinated strategy, the opponent, here, the bourgeoisie and the reactionary forces, could regroup and counterattack. Lenin's What is to be done served as the strategic manual that taught the revolutionary player how to develop the pieces, organize the party, form the Soviets, and prepare for the endgame of seizing state power. When the February uprising of 1917 occurred, it was as if the opponent had made a blunder, leaving the king exposed. Lenin's April theses then instructed the revolutionary player to capitalize on the mistake, advancing the queen, representing the Soviets, into a position of dominance. This chess metaphor underscores the importance of foresight, planning, and the ability to recognize and exploit moments of weakness. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how Lenin's ideas were not abstract musings but lived experiences. One such anecdote involves Lenin's meeting with the Bolshevik leader Alexander Bogdanov in 1904. The two men debated the role of scientific socialism versus proletarian culture. Bogdanov argued for a more inclusive cultural movement that would engage the masses directly, while Lenin insisted that without a disciplined party to channel the masses' energies, cultural initiatives would dissolve into fleeting fashions. Their heated exchange, recorded in the minutes of the St. Petersburg Social Democratic Club, highlighted the tension between spontaneity and organization, a tension that would later crystallize in Lenin's doctrine of the vanguard. Another anecdote comes from the winter of 1917, when Lenin, newly returned to Petrograd aboard the sealed train, visited a small factory in the district of Vyborg. There he met a group of workers who, despite the chaos of the provisional government, were still debating whether to join the Soviet or remain loyal to their trade union. Lenin listened, then said, "Your confusion is not a sign of weakness, but of the absence of a clear revolutionary direction. The party will provide that direction, not by imposing will, but by illuminating the path that your own interests already demand." This moment, recounted by the factory foreman in a memoir published in 1922, exemplifies how Lenin's theoretical prescriptions were tested and refined in the everyday interactions of ordinary workers. Quotes from primary sources anchor these narratives in the authentic voice of the actors themselves. From Marx's preface to the German ideology, we hear, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." Engels, in his 1845 essay, The Condition of the Working Class in England, declares, "The emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself." Lenin, in his 1905 pamphlet, writes, "The working class cannot achieve emanc when we turn our attention to the philosophical heart of the Bolshevik experiment. We find ourselves standing at the crossroads of theory and practice, of abstract ideas and concrete action." It is here, in that very intersection, that Vladimir Ilyich Lenin forged what he called democratic centralism and the vanguard party. These concepts were not merely organizational tweaks. They were, for Lenin, the logical outgrowth of a Marxist analysis of class, power, and the state, reshaped to meet the urgent demands of a revolution that was already in motion. In this segment, we will walk step by step through the origins of these ideas, hear the voices of those who debated them, examine the moments when they were put to the test, and consider the criticisms that continue to echo through the corridors of socialist thought. Let us begin with the question that occupied Lenin from the very moment he returned from exile in 1905. How could a revolutionary movement, born of the proletariat, maintain the necessary unity of action while preserving the freedom of discussion that Marx himself had prized? In What is to be done, he wrote, "The working class needs a vanguard of the most class-conscious and politically advanced elements of the proletariat." The phrase vanguard is not a casual metaphor. It is a deliberate invocation of a military formation that leads the charge, clears the way, and protects the troops that follow. For Lenin, the vanguard was to be a conscious, disciplined class, a party that would think and act on behalf of the broader masses, while simultaneously drawing those masses into its own revolutionary consciousness. But why did Lenin feel compelled to articulate a new kind of party? To answer that, we must return to the split of 1907, a moment that reveals both the philosophical stakes and the practical dilemmas of early Russian Marxism. At the Second Party Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the delegates were sharply divided over the very shape of the organization. The Mensheviks, led by figures such as Julius Martov, argued for a broad, mass-based party, one that would be open to anyone who accepted the program and was willing to work for it. Their slogan, "The party must be a mass party," echoed the democratic spirit of the 1848 revolutions and seemed to embody the Marxist ideal of a workers' movement that was itself a living expression of class consciousness. Lenin, however, saw a different horizon. In a letter to the Central Committee dated March 1907, he wrote, "If the party is to be the instrument of the working class, it must be a tightly knit organism, a fighting unit, not a loose association of sympathizers." He feared that a loosely organized mass party would be vulnerable to the reactionary forces that already dominated the Tsarist state, and that it would be unable to seize the decisive moments when history demanded a bold, coordinated strike. The philosophical justification for this stance lay in Lenin's reading of Marx's notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. For Marx, the state under capitalism was a tool of class oppression, and the transition to socialism required the working class to appropriate the state apparatus and use it to suppress the remnants of the bourgeois order. Lenin took this a step further. He argued that the working class in its spontaneous form could not yet wield such power without a disciplined cadre that could translate revolutionary theory into decisive, unified action. Thus emerged the principle of democratic centralism. The term itself is a juxtaposition of two seemingly contradictory ideas. Democratic points to the freedom of discussion, the right of party members to voice dissent, to debate tactics, to critique leadership. Centralism, on the other hand, demands strict adherence to the decisions that emerge from those discussions, once a majority has been reached. Lenin articulated this balance in his 1912 work, On the Unity of the Party and its Central Committee, where he wrote, "Within the party, there must be freedom of criticism and discussion. But outside the party, there must be absolute unity of action." The philosophical heart of this formulation rests on the belief that revolutionary struggle is a race against time, that the window for decisive action is narrow, and that any lingering indecision could be fatal. To understand how this principle functioned in practice, we need to look at the October 1917 coup, the moment when the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The decision to storm the Winter Palace was not the product of a single charismatic leader issuing a command from above. It was the culmination of a series of intense, secretive meetings of the Central Committee, the Politburo, and the Military Revolutionary Committee. In the days leading up to the coup, Lenin, Trotsky, and other leaders engaged in heated debates over the timing, the level of force to be employed, and the risks of alienating potential allies among the workers and soldiers. Trotsky's diary entry from the night of October 24 records, "We argue until the early hours, each of us presenting a different scenario. Yet, when the vote is taken, the majority says, 'Seize the power now before the provisional government can regroup.' Once that majority was established, the decision was communicated through a chain of command that left little room for further dissent. The ensuing action, coordinated assaults on the telegraph office, the state bank, and finally the Winter Palace, exemplified the centralist side of democratic centralism. The party moved as a single organism, each unit executing the plan with disciplined precision. Yet the democratic element was not entirely absent. The very fact that the decision emerged from a vote, after a period of open debate, illustrates Lenin's insistence that the party's power must be rooted in internal democracy. In his own words recorded in the minutes of the Central Committee meeting on October 22, Lenin declared, "The party must decide together, and then each comrade must obey the decision as if it were his own." The paradox here is striking. A party that demands absolute obedience to a collective decision, yet requires that decision to be the product of genuine, if sometimes heated, discussion. It is a paradox that has both fascinated and troubled scholars for over a century. A second concrete illustration of democratic centralism in action can be found in the 1918 Party Congress, held in the aftermath of the October Revolution. The Congress was convened to address a pressing question. What should be the criteria for party membership? Should the party open its doors to anyone who professed revolutionary sympathies, or should it retain a strict gatekeeping mechanism to ensure ideological purity and operational reliability? The debate was fierce. On one side stood the broadening faction, which argued that the revolutionary wave sweeping the Russian countryside required an influx of new members to sustain the nascent Soviet state. On the other side, the restrictive faction, led by Lenin himself, warned that an uncontrolled expansion would dilute the party's revolutionary character and open the floodgates to opportunists and counter-revolutionaries. The transcripts of the Congress reveal a rich tapestry of arguments. The broadening faction quoted Rosa Luxemburg's warning that the mass strike is the most effective weapon of the working class, suggesting that a larger party would be better positioned to mobilize mass action. Lenin countered with a reference to Marx's critique of trade union consciousness, noting that the working class, if left to its own spontaneous development, will oscillate between reformism and reaction. After hours of debate, a vote was taken. The majority sided with Lenin's position, and the party adopted a stricter set of criteria. Prospective members had to demonstrate a proven commitment to the revolutionary cause, undergo a period of probation, and receive the endorsement of 2 existing members. The decision was then disseminated through the party's central organs, and local cells were instructed to implement the new rules without deviation. Here again, the democratic process of discussion and voting was followed by a centralist implementation that left little room for dissent. These 2 historical moments, October 1917 and the 1918 Congress, serve as vivid case studies of how democratic centralism functioned as both a philosophical justification and an operational method. They also illustrate the delicate balance Lenin sought to maintain, a balance that was, from the very beginning, contested from within the socialist movement itself. Turning now to the philosophical roots of the vanguard party, we must recall Lenin's 1915 essay, The State and Revolution. In this work, Lenin revisited and refined Marx's analysis of the state as an instrument of class oppression. He argued that the bourgeois state is not a neutral arbiter but a machine for the oppression of one class by another. Yet unlike Marx, who envisioned the state withering away after the proletariat seized power, Lenin emphasized the necessity of a temporary revolutionary state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, to suppress the remnants of the bourgeoisie and to organize the economic transition to socialism. In a striking passage he wrote, "The state is a special organization of force. It is an organ of class rule. The proletariat must therefore create its own state, a state which will be the instrument of the working class's own domination over the former ruling class." The vanguard, in Lenin's view, was the conscious embodiment of this state, a disciplined cadre that could both wield state power and educate the masses in revolutionary consciousness. The vanguard concept also draws on earlier philosophical traditions. Lenin was deeply influenced by the German idealist tradition, particularly Hegel's notion of the world spirit that unfolds through dialectical stages. He saw the vanguard as the subjective spirit that guides the objective historical process, ensuring that the dialectic does not stall in a period of false consciousness. Moreover, Lenin's emphasis on the role of a disciplined elite echoes the ideas of the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini, who argued that the nation is the product of a moral and intellectual elite. While Lenin rejected Mazzini's bourgeois nationalism, he appropriated the structural insight that a committed minority could catalyze the awakening of the masses. The philosophical justification for democratic centralism thus rests on 2 pillars. First, there is the epistemic claim that the working class, in its spontaneous form, lacks the necessary theoretical clarity to navigate the complexities of revolutionary strategy. Second, there is the strategic claim that the revolutionary moment is fleeting, and that any delay caused by endless debate would hand victory to the reactionary forces. Lenin's synthesis of these claims produced a model in which freedom of discussion is preserved within the party, but once a decision is reached, all members must act in unison. It is a model that has been praised for its efficiency and criticized for its potential to stifle dissent. One of the most prominent internal critics of democratic centralism was Leon Trotsky, Lenin's close comrade and later rival. Trotsky's critique is articulated in his 1926 work, The Revolution Betrayed, where he laments that the party has become a bureaucratic apparatus, a monolithic entity that no longer tolerates internal democracy. Trotsky argued that the centralist tendency, once institutionalized, would inevitably erode the democratic core of the party, leading to a new class of bureaucrats who would dominate the proletariat from above. He pointed to the growing concentration of power in the hands of the Central Committee and the Politburo as evidence that the original promise of internal debate had been abandoned. Trotsky's concern was not merely procedural. He feared that the suppression of internal dissent would produce a party that could not correct its own mistakes, thereby jeopardizing the very revolutionary project it claimed to serve. Beyond Trotsky's Marxist critique, libertarian socialists have offered a different line of objection. Thinkers such as Anton Pannekoek and the Council Communist tradition argue that the vanguard party, by its very nature, reproduces a new elite, a new ruling class that replaces the bourgeoisie without dismantling hierarchical authority. Pannekoek wrote, "The party, however disciplined, remains a hierarchy. It cannot be the instrument of workers' self-emancipation if it retains the power to command." From this perspective, democratic centralism is seen as a thin veneer over a fundamentally authoritarian structure, one that merely changes the face of domination while preserving its mechanisms. Modern libertarian socialist movements, from the Zapatistas in Chiapas to the Rojava experiment in northern Syria, frequently cite these critiques, emphasizing horizontal decision-making and direct democracy as antidotes to the vanguard model. These counter-arguments raise essential questions about the relationship between means and ends. If the goal is a classless, stateless society, can the means involve a tightly controlled, hierarchical organization? Or does the very existence of such an organization preempt the possibility of a truly emancipated future? Lenin himself anticipated some of these concerns. In his later writings, particularly the Letter to the Party of 1921, he warned that the party must guard against the temptation to become a privileged class. He called for constant self-criticism, for the rotation of officials, and for the cultivation of a healthy atmosphere of discussion. Whether these safeguards were sufficient or merely rhetorical remains a matter of ongoing debate. To further illuminate the lived experience of democratic centralism, let us revisit the October 1917 decision-making process, this time focusing on the role of the Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC. The MRC was a body composed of Bolshevik leaders, soldiers, and sailors, tasked with coordinating the armed uprising. Its meetings were marked by a rapid exchange of reports, strategic proposals, and heated arguments. On October 24, the MRC debated whether to seize the telegraph office first or to focus on the state bank. Some members argued that controlling communications would cripple the provisional government's ability to coordinate a response. Others insisted that seizing the bank would provide the necessary funds to finance the revolution. After a brief but intense discussion, the majority voted to prioritize the telegraph office. The decision was then transmitted in a single, crisp order to the Red Guards stationed throughout the city. Within hours, the telegraph office fell under Bolshevik control, and the subsequent actions unfolded according to the central plan. This episode demonstrates how democratic centralism allowed for a rapid synthesis of diverse viewpoints into a unified operational directive. Contrast this with the 1918 Party Congress debate on membership criteria. Here, the discussion stretched over several days, with delegates presenting speeches, quoting Marx, Lenin, and even the German socialist Karl. The broadening faction invoked the mass strike as a means of building class consciousness, while the restrictive faction warned that an influx of untested members could lead to opportunism. The vote was close, reflecting a genuine division within the party. Yet once the decision was made, the Central Committee issued a circular that instructed all local committees to implement the new membership standards within a fortnight. No further debate was permitted. The central directive was absolute. In this way, the centralist component of democratic centralism ensured that the party could adapt its structure swiftly, even when internal disagreement persisted. The philosophical stakes of these episodes become clearer when we consider Lenin's broader vision of the state. In The State and Revolution, he argued that the proletarian state must be a dictatorship of the proletariat, that is both an instrument of class rule and a school for the development of socialist consciousness. The vanguard party, as the leading organ of this state, is tasked with two seemingly contradictory roles. It must exercise coercive power to suppress the bourgeoisie, while simultaneously fostering the emancipation of the working class. This dual function is at the heart of the tension that democratic centralism seeks to resolve. By allowing internal debate, the party can refine its tactics and policies. By demanding external unity, it can wield state power effectively. Later scholars have linked Lenin's ideas to the concept of political subjectivity developed by the Frankfurt School. The notion that a disciplined group can shape the consciousness of a broader mass resonates with Theodor Adorno's critique of culture industry as a mechanism for shaping public opinion. While Adorno was highly critical of any top-down manipulation, the structural similarity is striking. Both Lenin's vanguard and the culture industry rely on a relatively small group to influence the masses, albeit with very different ends. This comparison underscores the broader philosophical question: to what extent can any movement, even one committed to emancipation, avoid reproducing hierarchical structures? We have also seen how Lenin's ideas intersect with the later work of Antonio Gramsci, who, in his prison notebooks, spoke of the organic intellectual as the party's role in articulating and disseminating revolutionary ideas. Gramsci's concept of a historic bloc, a coalition of forces that share a common worldview, parallels Lenin's vanguard, but Gramsci emphasizes the need for a war of position that involves building cultural hegemony, not just seizing state power. Gramsci's cautionary notes about the dangers of over-centralization echo Trotsky's concerns, suggesting that Lenin's model, while powerful, may require adaptation to avoid the ossification of revolutionary leadership. The real-world applications of democratic centralism extend beyond the early Soviet experience. In the Chinese Communist Party's early years, Mao Zedong adapted Lenin's model to a largely agrarian context, emphasizing the importance of mass line while retaining a centralist command structure. Mao's famous slogan, "From the masses to the masses," can be read as an attempt to reconcile Lenin's vanguard with a more participatory approach, though the practical outcomes often mirrored the centralist tendencies of the Soviet model. More recently, the Cuban Communist Party has maintained a strict democratic centralist framework, arguing that it preserves the revolutionary gains of 1959 while allowing for limited internal debate on economic reforms. Yet the libertarian, the notion that a state can be both an instrument of oppression and, paradoxically, a vehicle for emancipation sits at the very heart of Vladimir Lenin's political philosophy. When we first encounter the phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, in Marx's critique of the Gotha program, we hear a terse promise that the working class will, for a limited time, hold the reins of power in order to dismantle the class structures that have long bound humanity. Yet Marx offers only a sketch, a brief outline of a transitional phase that would, in his vision, dissolve as soon as class antagonisms disappear. It is Lenin who takes that sketch, stretches it across the canvas of a concrete revolution, and fills in the details with a rigor that both clarifies and complicates the original formulation. In this segment, we will explore how Lenin reinterpreted the state, why he insisted that the proletariat must first seize it, how he envisioned its eventual withering away, and what the historical record tells us about the tensions embedded in that vision. Let us begin by recalling the intellectual lineage that led Lenin to his particular reading of the state. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto described the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. They argued that the state exists to manage the affairs of the ruling class, to protect private property, and to enforce the conditions that keep the proletariat in a subordinate position. In the German ideology, they famously wrote that the state is a special organization of force, a committee for the oppression of one class by another. For Marx, the abolition of the state was not a distant utopia. It was the natural outcome of a classless society, a process that would be accelerated by the revolutionary seizure of state power by the working class. However, Marx's own writings leave open the mechanics of that seizure, the nature of the transitional authority, and the precise timetable for the state's disappearance. Lenin, writing in the tumultuous years following the February and October revolutions of 1917, confronted these ambiguities head-on. In his seminal work State and Revolution, published in 1917 but not widely distributed until after the Bolsheviks had taken power, Lenin argued that the proletariat could not simply let the state go without first establishing a new form of state power that would actively suppress the bourgeoisie. He famously declared, "The state is a special organization of force, a committee for the oppression of one class by another." Yet, unlike Marx, Lenin insisted that the proletarian state must be a revolutionary state, a tool of class domination turned on its former masters. He wrote, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is not the dictatorship of a single individual or a party. It is the dictatorship of the whole working class, exercised through a state apparatus that must be used to crush the resistance of the exploiting class." In other words, the state does not simply vanish because the proletariat has taken power. It must be wielded, consciously and temporarily, as a weapon against the forces that would seek to restore capitalism. To understand why Lenin felt this was necessary, we must consider the material conditions of Russia in 1917. The old Tsarist bureaucracy had been dismantled, but the country remained deeply divided. The bourgeoisie, though weakened, still owned the bulk of industry and finance. The peasantry, though nominally free, faced hunger, land shortages, and the threat of counter-revolutionary forces. Moreover, the nascent Soviet government was surrounded by hostile armies, both foreign interventionists and white forces intent on crushing the revolution. Lenin argued that without a centralized, coercive apparatus, the proletariat would be unable to defend the revolution from these enemies. He famously wrote in his April theses, "We must seize the state not to preserve it, but to use it as a means of crushing the bourgeoisie and then letting it wither away." The phrase, "seize the state," is not a call for a permanent bureaucracy. It is a tactical decision, a recognition that the revolutionary process unfolds within a world that still respects, at least in part, the language of power, coercion, and authority. One of the most vivid illustrations of Lenin's theory and practice is the creation of the Cheka in December 1918. The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, as it was officially titled, was conceived as a provisional instrument of proletarian power, a temporary organ tasked with rooting out enemies of the people, protecting the revolution from internal and external threats, and ensuring the smooth implementation of revolutionary policies. Lenin, in a letter to the Central Committee, described the Cheka as the necessary organ for the execution of the Revolutionary War. He did not envision the Cheka as a permanent fixture of Soviet life. Rather, he saw it as a temporary measure, a revolutionary police that would become obsolete once the bourgeois resistance was fully extinguished. The Cheka's early actions, arrests, trials, and executions were justified by Lenin as indispensable to the survival of the proletarian state. Yet the very existence of such an organ underscores the paradox at the core of Lenin's argument. The proletarian state must be both a tool of emancipation and a tool of repression. A second, equally instructive example is the new economic policy, introduced in 1921. After the devastation of the Civil War and the harshness of war communism, Lenin announced a tactical retreat, a partial reintroduction of market mechanisms, private trade, and limited small-scale private enterprise. In his speech to the Ninth Party Congress, Lenin declared, "We must keep the state in the hands of the proletariat, but we must also recognize the necessity of a temporary mixed economy to rebuild the material base of socialism." The NEP was, in Lenin's view, a strategic concession, a way to alleviate the economic crisis while preserving the political dominance of the proletariat. It illustrates Lenin's willingness to adapt his theory of the state to concrete conditions, to balance the need for a strong, centralized authority with the practical demands of a war-torn economy. The NEP was not a betrayal of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Rather, it was a recalibration, an acknowledgement that the state's role could shift from direct economic control to a more supervisory, regulatory function, still aimed at preventing the resurgence of bourgeois power. These two examples, the Cheka and the NEP, show us how Lenin's theory of the state was not a static doctrine but a dynamic strategy, responsive to the shifting terrain of revolution. Yet as we examine these historical moments, we also encounter the criticisms that have haunted Lenin's legacy from the very beginning. The first major critique comes from the anarchist tradition, which argues that any state, even one ostensibly controlled by the proletariat, inevitably becomes a source of oppression. Mikhail Bakunin, the 19th-century Russian anarchist, famously warned that the state is a monster, a prison, an apparatus of domination, and it will always remain so, no matter who holds the reins. Anarchists contend that the moment a revolutionary movement creates a new state apparatus, it reproduces the very hierarchy it seeks to abolish. In the context of Lenin's Russia, the Cheka serves as a potent illustration of this critique, an organ designed to protect the proletarian state, yet one that exercised terror, bypassed due process, and entrenched a culture of fear. Anarchist thinkers such as Peter Kropotkin, in his Mutual Aid, argued that cooperative, decentralized forms of organization could replace the need for a coercive state, allowing workers to self-manage without the intermediary of a central authority. From this perspective, Lenin's insistence on a dictatorship of the proletariat is seen not as a necessary transitional phase, but as a perpetuation of state power under a different banner. A second line of criticism emerges from revisionist Marxists, many of whom were active in the early 20th century and later in the post-World War II period. These thinkers, such as Anton Pannekoek and later the Council Communists, argued that the working class could bypass the state entirely by forming workers' councils, direct democratic bodies that would manage production and distribution without the mediation of a centralized state. Pannekoek wrote in the Workers' Council, "The emancipation of the working class must be achieved through the direct, democratic control of the means of production, not through the seizure of a state apparatus that will inevitably become a new class." Revisionist Marxists claim that Lenin's model reproduces a top-down hierarchy, where a vanguard party directs the masses, thereby stifling the very spontaneity and self-activity that Marx envisioned as the engine of revolutionary change. They point to the early Soviets of 1917, workers' councils that, in theory, could have functioned as the basis for a decentralized, stateless society, as evidence that an alternative path existed. The revisionist argument is that the Bolshevik leadership, in consolidating power and suppressing other socialist factions, closed off this possibility, cementing a state that would later evolve into a bureaucratic apparatus far removed from the original revolutionary ideals. These counter-arguments are not merely academic, they echo through the very fabric of contemporary leftist debates. When we examine modern movements, whether the Zapatista autonomous municipalities in Chiapas, the Rojava cantons in northern Syria, or the workers' cooperatives emerging in post-industrial economies, we see recurring questions. Do we need a state to protect revolutionary gains, or can we construct alternative structures that render the state obsolete? Lenin's own writings anticipate some of these tensions. In State and Revolution, he warned that the working class must not be content with a merely formal seizure of state power. It must transform the state into a new instrument of class rule. Yet he also cautioned that, if the proletariat does not learn to use the state as a weapon against the bourgeoisie, the revolution will be crushed. The balance between using the state as a tool and allowing it to become a new source of domination remains a delicate, perhaps impossible, equilibrium. To appreciate how Lenin navigated this balance, let us turn to two specific historical documents that reveal his strategic thinking. In March 1918, the Bolshevik government issued a decree on the nationalization of banks. Lenin wrote, "All banks are to be transferred to the exclusive ownership of the state, and all their assets shall become the property of the people." This decree was not merely an economic measure. It was a political act that transferred the financial levers of power from private capitalists to the proletarian state. By nationalizing the banks, Lenin aimed to cut off the bourgeoisie's ability to finance counter-revolutionary activities, to control credit, and to influence the economy from behind the scenes. The decree also symbolized the transformation of the state from a neutral arbiter into an active participant in the redistribution of wealth. Yet, as the years progressed, the centralized control over finance became a double-edged sword, contributing to the inefficiencies and shortages that later prompted the NEP. This episode illustrates Lenin's willingness to wield the state's economic apparatus directly, but also his later recognition that such direct control could be counterproductive, necessitating a tactical retreat. A second document, Lenin's 1919 letter to the Central Committee, provides a vivid glimpse into his mindset during the height of the Civil War. In that letter, he wrote, "The revolutionary war communism we have adopted is not a permanent system. It is a temporary necessity dictated by the exigencies of war. We must use every instrument of power to ensure the survival of the revolution, even if it means imposing strict requisitioning and centralized distribution." Here, Lenin acknowledges that the harsh measures of war communism, forced grain requisition, nationalization of industry, and the suppression of dissent, are not ends in themselves but means to an end. He frames them as a temporary necessity, a concession to the harsh reality of a civil war where the proletarian state is under siege. The letter underscores the central tension in Lenin's theory. The state must be flexible enough to adopt severe measures when required, yet always oriented toward the eventual goal of withering away. This flexibility, however, also opened the door to the justification of increasingly authoritarian practices, a point that critics like the anarchists and council communists would later seize upon. When we examine these primary sources alongside the historical actions they inspired, we see a pattern. Lenin's theory of the state is a series of calculated compromises, each designed to preserve the revolutionary momentum in the face of external and internal threats. The Cheka, the nationalization of banks, war communism, and the NEP, all are moments where the state's role expands, contracts, and reshapes itself according to the demands of the moment. Lenin's own words, "The state must become the instrument of the proletariat," and then, as the class itself disappears, the state must disappear, encapsulate this dynamic vision. He does not present the withering away of the state as a passive process. It is an active, intentional dissolution that must be overseen by the proletariat itself. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy that Lenin himself used, albeit indirectly, when discussing the state's role. Imagine a gardener who must first pull out the weeds that threaten a garden's health. The gardener may need to use a sharp tool, perhaps even a hoe that cuts deep into the soil, to remove the most stubborn roots. Once the weeds are gone, the gardener does not discard the hoe. Instead, he sets it aside, allowing the garden to flourish without further interference. In Lenin's metaphor, the state is the hoe, a necessary instrument of removal. The proletarian class is the gardener, wielding the tool to uproot the bourgeois weeds. Once the soil is cleared, the gardener puts the hoe away, allowing the garden, society, to grow organically. This analogy helps to illuminate why Lenin did not see the state as an immutable structure, but as a temporary, functional organ whose purpose is to be decommissioned once its task is complete. Historical anecdotes further enrich this picture. One anecdote concerns the first meeting of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets in October 1917, where the Bolsheviks, though a minority, managed to secure a decisive vote on the transfer of power. The famous exchange between Lenin and the Menshevik deputy, who asked, "What will you do with the state once you have seized it?" prompted Lenin to answer, "We will use it to smash the bourgeoisie, and then we will let it dissolve." This moment captures the immediacy of Lenin's resolve. The state is not an end, but a means, and its dissolution is built into the revolutionary agenda from the outset. A second anecdote comes from the early days of the Cheka's operations in Petrograd. The first director, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was instructed by Lenin to act decisively, but not indiscriminately. Dzerzhinsky's memoirs recount a meeting where Lenin emphasized that the Cheka should be a temporary instrument of proletarian power, not a permanent police state. Yet, within months, the Cheka's scope expanded dramatically, leading to a period of what many historians term the Red Terror. This trajectory illustrates the difficulty of containing a revolutionary instrument within its intended temporal limits, a challenge that has haunted subsequent socialist experiments. The interplay between Lenin's theory and its implementation also invites us to cross-reference earlier discussions of democratic centralism, a principle that Lenin articulated as the organizational backbone of the Bolshevik Party. Democratic centralism, as we explored in the preceding section, combines internal debate with strict external unity. The same logic underpins the creation of the Cheka and the enforcement of war communism. Open discussion within the party, followed by unified, decisive action once a decision is made. This principle, while intended to preserve revolutionary discipline, also facilitated the rapid centralization of power that critics argue transformed the proletarian state into a bureaucratic apparatus. Later, when we move to the section on Lenin's legacy and ethical assessments, we will see how scholars evaluate this tension, whether democratic centralism served as a necessary conduit for revolutionary efficiency, or whether it became a conduit for authoritarian excess. Turning now to modern interpretations, scholars have revisited Lenin's state theory through various lenses. Some Marxist-Leninist thinkers, such as Ernest Mandel, argue that Lenin's approach remains relevant for contemporary struggles against imperialism. Mandel writes, "The necessity of a proletarian state does not disappear because we have learned from past mistakes. It persists wherever the working class must defend its gains against a hostile capitalist system." In this view, the state is seen as a defensive shield, a temporary bulwark that can be wielded responsibly if the working class remains vigilant about its eventual dissolution. Conversely, post-structuralist thinkers like Michel Foucault have offered a more skeptical reading. Foucault's analysis of power as diffuse and productive, rather than merely repressive, suggests that even a proletarian state generates new forms of knowledge, surveillance, and discipline. He would likely view the Cheka not merely as a temporary instrument, but as a node in a broader network of power relations that persists beyond its original purpose. This perspective resonates with the anarchist critique, emphasizing that power, once instantiated, acquires a life of its own, often independent of its original ideological justification. In contemporary activist circles, the debate over the role of the state resurfaces in discussions about prefigurative politics, the attempt to create in the present the social relations of a future society. The Zapatista movement, for instance, rejects the creation of a new state, opting instead for autonomous municipalities that manage education, health, and justice without relying on a centralized authority. Their approach mirrors the council communist vision that revisionist Marxists championed, a network of directly democratic bodies that sidestep the need for a transitional state. Yet the Zapatistas also maintain an armed wing, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, which they justify as a defensive force when we turn our attention to the moral calculus that underpinned Vladimir Lenin's revolutionary project. We are forced to confront a terrain where ethical theory collides with the harsh exigencies of political struggle. Lenin did not present his justification for violence as a mere tactical convenience. Rather, he wove it into a broader philosophical framework that he believed was demanded by history itself. In his own words, the revolutionary struggle, in order to succeed, must be guided by a revolutionary conscience, a consciousness that knows when the use of terror is indispensable for the preservation of the revolution. This assertion, first articulated in the pamphlet, The Necessity of Terror, and later reiterated in the 1919 work The State and Revolution, reveals a conviction that the ends of socialist emancipation could legitimize the most extreme means. As we unpack this claim, we must ask, what logical steps did Lenin follow to arrive at such a conclusion, and how did he reconcile the apparent conflict between the Marxist ideal of a classless, humane society and the brutal reality of bloodshed? Lenin's ethical reasoning begins with his interpretation of historical materialism as a deterministic engine that propels society toward a communist future. He argued that the transition from capitalism to socialism was not a smooth, linear progression, but a violent rupture, a great leap forward that could not be achieved through the gradual reforms championed by the bourgeoisie. In The State and Revolution, he wrote, "The bourgeois state is a machinery for the oppression of the working class. The proletarian state must therefore be a machinery for the destruction of the bourgeois state." For Lenin, the state was not a neutral arbiter of justice, but an instrument of class domination, and the only way to dismantle the old apparatus was to replace it with a new one that could, at least temporarily, employ coercion. This view placed the moral weight of the revolutionary act on the side of the oppressed masses, who, he claimed, possessed a higher claim to moral authority than the ruling class that had perpetuated exploitation for centuries. From this premise, Lenin derived what he called the revolutionary conscience. Unlike the conventional conscience, which he saw as shaped by the prevailing moral codes of a capitalist society, the revolutionary conscience is forged in the crucible of class struggle. It is a collective awareness that perceives the preservation of the revolution as a supreme moral imperative, even if that requires acts that would be condemned in ordinary peacetime. He famously asserted, "When the revolution is threatened, the revolutionary conscience commands that we must act without hesitation, for the salvation of the proletariat depends on it." In this sense, the moral evaluation of an act is not fixed by universal standards, but by its contribution to the historical process of overthrowing oppression. The ends, namely the establishment of a classless society, become the yardstick against which the means are measured. Yet Lenin's reasoning was never presented as an abstract justification divorced from concrete experience. He repeatedly pointed to the concrete conditions of post-1917 Russia, a country ravaged by civil war, foreign intervention, and internal dissent that threatened to undo the nascent Soviet power. In the face of such existential danger, he argued, the revolutionary government could not afford the luxury of deliberation or moral hesitation. In his 1920 speech to the Fourth Party Congress, Lenin declared, "We cannot be idle while the counter-revolutionaries gather strength. The use of force is not a choice, it is an obligation." This speech, delivered in the midst of a brutal civil war, illustrates how Lenin's moral calculus was inseparably linked to the perceived immediacy of the threat. For him, the moral legitimacy of terror was not an abstract principle, but a response to a concrete emergency. The Red Terror of 1918-19 provides a stark illustration of this logic in action. Following the assassination of the German ambassador Wilhelm von Mirbach and the attempted White Uprising in Moscow, Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership launched a systematic campaign of repression aimed at eliminating class enemies and counter-revolutionary elements. The Cheka, the new Soviet secret police, was granted sweeping powers to arrest, imprison, and execute without trial. In official communiques, the terror was framed as a necessary defensive measure. The Red Terror is the iron fist that will crush the reactionary forces and secure the revolution for the working masses. The logic was clear. By eradicating the sources of counter-revolutionary activity, the Bolsheviks believed they were safeguarding the larger historical goal of socialism. In Lenin's own writings, he praised the terror as the most effective weapon of the proletariat and insisted that the blood of the enemies of the people is the price of the future happiness of the working class. The moral calculus here is stark. The deaths of a few are justified by the promise of a future where the majority will be free from exploitation. A second, equally significant, example is the suppression of the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921. The sailors of the Kronstadt naval base, once hailed as the guardians of the revolution, rose in protest against the Bolshevik government's policies of requisitioning grain and suppressing political freedoms. Their demands included the restoration of civil liberties and the end of the Cheka's arbitrary power. Lenin, viewing this insurrection as a betrayal of revolutionary discipline, ordered a decisive military response. He wrote in a private note, "If the Kronstadt sailors are allowed to set a precedent, the revolution will be undone. We must crush this deviation with iron resolve." The resulting assault led to thousands of deaths and the brutal quashing of the uprising. In Lenin's view, the use of force against former comrades was a tragic but necessary act to prevent the disintegration of the revolutionary state. He rationalized the violence by invoking the concept of revolutionary conscience once more. The moral duty to protect the revolution outweighed the personal loyalty owed to former allies. These two episodes are not isolated incidents, but are woven into a broader pattern of Lenin's ethical reasoning. the willingness to employ terror when the survival of the revolution is perceived to be at stake. However, Lenin's own reflections on these events reveal a degree of personal unease. In a diary entry dated July 17, 1918, after the execution of the Romanov family, Lenin wrote, "The blood that has been shed today stains our hands, yet the necessity of the act haunts me. I cannot deny the relief that the Tsar's death brings to the people, but the weight of the deed presses upon my conscience." This private confession hints at an internal tension between the revolutionary imperative and the human cost of its execution. It also demonstrates that Lenin was aware of the moral gravity of his decisions, even as he publicly defended them. The ethical tension becomes even more pronounced when we examine Lenin's 1920 speech defending the use of force against counter-revolutionaries. In that address, he proclaimed, "The proletariat cannot afford to be compassionate toward those who would see it destroyed." The revolutionary struggle demands a hardness of heart, yet the same speech contains a moment of rhetorical pause where Lenin acknowledges, "I do not relish the shedding of blood, but I cannot allow the enemy to dictate the terms of our existence." The juxtaposition of these statements offers a glimpse into the paradox at the heart of Lenin's moral reasoning. The conviction that violence is both a necessary evil and a regrettable burden. To fully grasp the implications of Lenin's justification of terror, we must also consider the counter-arguments that have been raised by later moral philosophers. Hannah Arendt, in her seminal work The Origins of Totalitarianism, offers a stark critique of Leninist terror as a precursor to totalitarian domination. Arendt argues that the systematic use of terror erodes the public sphere, extinguishes pluralism, and creates a climate where the state can act without accountability. She writes, "When terror becomes the instrument of the state, the distinction between law and lawlessness collapses, and the individual is reduced to a mere object of power." From Arendt's perspective, Lenin's moral calculus fails to recognize that the very act of legitimizing terror plants the seeds for a regime that ultimately betrays its emancipatory promises. She contends that the moral cost of terror cannot be outweighed by any future ideal, because the means reshape the political reality in ways that make the promised ends unattainable. A second line of critique emerges from within the Marxist tradition itself. Pacifist Marxists such as Rosa Luxemburg and later revolutionary socialists like Antonio Gramsci have argued that the reliance on violent coercion is not an inevitable necessity of class struggle, but a strategic choice that can be avoided. Luxemburg, in her The Mass Strike, emphasized the power of mass action and spontaneous workers' self-organization as a means to challenge capitalist structures without resorting to state terror. She wrote, "The working class must not become the instrument of a new tyranny. It must retain its moral integrity by refusing the tools of oppression." Gramsci, writing from prison, warned that the war of position, the cultural and ideological struggle, could achieve lasting change without the bloodshed of a war of maneuver. Both thinkers contend that Lenin's moral calculus overlooks alternative pathways to revolutionary transformation that preserve ethical integrity. They argue that the adoption of terror not only risks alienating the very masses it seeks to liberate, but also creates a moral debt that the new society will be forced to repay. These counter-arguments invite us to reflect on a deeper philosophical question. Can a political movement that seeks to create a just society ever employ unjust means without contaminating its ultimate goals? Lenin would answer affirmatively, invoking the principle of the end justifies the means. Yet the critics we have just heard suggest that the means are not merely instrumental but constitutive. They shape the very nature of the ends that can be realized. In this sense, the moral calculus is not a simple arithmetic of costs and benefits, but a dynamic process where means and ends co-evolve. To illuminate this dynamic, let us consider an analogy from the realm of medicine. Imagine a surgeon faced with a life-threatening infection that can only be eradicated by amputation. The decision to cut off a limb is undeniably painful and irreversible, yet it may be the only way to save the patient's life. In this analogy, the surgeon's moral calculus weighs the immediate loss against the preservation of the whole. However, if the surgeon were to amputate without clear necessity, the patient's trust in the medical profession would be shattered, and the very practice of medicine would be called into question. Similarly, Lenin's justification of terror can be seen as an attempt to perform a surgical amputation on the counter-revolutionary forces, believing that the loss of life was a necessary sacrifice for the health of the revolutionary body. The counter-argument then asks whether the surgeon, here the revolutionary leader, has the authority to decide the threshold of necessity, and whether the act of cutting itself transforms the patient's or society's capacity to heal. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding of this moral tension. One such story involves the Bolshevik commander Leon Trotsky, who, during the suppression of the Tambov peasant uprising in 1921, reportedly ordered the use of chemical weapons against the rebels. Trotsky later reflected, "We have become the very monsters we once condemned." This anecdote illustrates how the deployment of terror can spiral beyond the original intent, creating a feedback loop where the revolutionary elite become desensitized to violence. Another anecdote concerns the poet Alexander Blok, who, after witnessing the execution of a former Tsarist officer, wrote in a letter, "The blood that stains the streets of Petrograd is a bitter reminder that the revolution's soul is being consumed by its own fire." Blok's lament captures the cultural and emotional cost of Lenin's moral choices, suggesting that the artistic conscience of the time was deeply unsettled by the state's embrace of terror. Returning to Lenin's own words, we find a recurring motif of necessity. In a 1919 article for Pravda, he declared, "When the revolution is threatened, the revolutionary conscience commands that we must act without hesitation, for the salvation of the proletariat depends on it." Yet, in a private correspondence to his wife Nadezhda Krupskaya, he confessed, "I am haunted by the specter of the blood we have shed. I hope that history will judge us kindly." This duality, public proclamation of necessity paired with private doubt, reveals the complexity of Lenin's moral reasoning. It was not a cold, detached calculation alone. It was also a deeply human struggle to reconcile the urgency of political survival with the weight of ethical responsibility. When we cross-reference this discussion with the earlier examination of the Bolshevik party's structure, a pattern emerges. The centralization of power within the party's Politburo created a decision-making apparatus where a small elite could determine the scope and intensity of terror. Lenin's advocacy for a vanguard party, as outlined in What Is to Be Done, argued that only a disciplined, tightly organized group could steer the masses through the turbulence of revolution. This structural concentration amplified the moral responsibility of a few individuals, making the ethical stakes even higher. The later influence of Lenin's approach on socialist regimes, whether in Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, or the Cuban Revolution, can be traced back to this same calculus of ends and means, where the party's authority to deploy violence was normalized as a legitimate tool of governance. In modern interpretations, scholars such as Michael Burley and Stephen Kotkin have revisited Lenin's moral reasoning through the lens of political realism. They argue that Lenin's emphasis on terror was not an ideological excess, but a pragmatic response to a fragmented, war-torn Russia surrounded by hostile forces. Kotkin writes, Lenin understood that the fledgling Soviet state was a fortress under siege. The use of terror was, in his view, the mortar that kept the walls from crumbling. Yet even within this realist framework, the question persists. Does pragmatic necessity absolve moral culpability? The answer remains contested, and the debate continues to shape our understanding of revolutionary ethics. To further illustrate the lingering relevance of Lenin's moral calculus, consider a contemporary scenario in which a movement fighting against an oppressive regime contemplates the use of targeted assassinations to dismantle a corrupt leadership. The activists might invoke Lenin's logic, arguing that eliminating the architects of oppression is essential to safeguard the broader struggle. Critics, echoing Arendt and the pacifist Marxists, would warn that such tactics risk reproducing the very structures of domination they aim to destroy. The conversation thus circles back to the central question: can the revolutionary conscience be insulated from the corrupting influence of the means it sanctions? In reflecting on Lenin's ethical framework, we are reminded of a passage from the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus. It is not events that disturb us but our judgments about them. Lenin's judgment that terror was an indispensable instrument shaped the events of his era in profound and often tragic ways. Whether one views his moral reasoning as a necessary evil, a tragic miscalculation, or a deliberate choice to forge a new order, it remains a pivotal case study in the philosophy of political violence. The tension between the urgency of revolutionary transformation and the timeless demand for moral integrity continues to echo through the corridors of political thought. As we conclude this segment, let us pause and consider the lingering resonance of Lenin's words. The revolutionary struggle, in order to succeed, must be guided by a revolutionary conscience, a consciousness that knows when the use of terror is indispensable for the preservation of the revolution. The phrase invites us to interrogate our own revolutionary consciences, wherever they may arise, in social movements, in policy debates, in personal choices. It asks us to weigh the cost of each action against the vision of a more just world, while remaining ever mindful that the means we endorse will shape the very shape of the future we seek. In this reflective space, we find the enduring relevance of Lenin's moral calculus, not as a prescription, but as a cautionary tale that challenges us to examine the ethical foundations of any struggle for profound change. When we turn our gaze toward the afterlife of Lenin's thought, we are confronted not merely with a static set of doctrines, but with a living, contested terrain that has stretched across the tumult of the 20th century and continues to ripple through the politics of the 21st. The legacy of Lenin is, in many ways, a mirror that reflects the aspirations, the anxieties, and the contradictions of every generation that has tried to wrestle with the problem of how a revolutionary movement might translate theory into practice. In this segment, we will walk through the major reinterpretations of Lenin's philosophy, from the Stalinist consolidation of power through Trotsky's radical divergence to the critical engagements of Western Marxist scholars such as Georg and Louis Althusser. We will then bring the discussion into the present, examining how contemporary left-wing parties and anti-imperialist movements still invoke Leninist organizational principles, while also hearing the voices of those who claim that Lenin's ideas have outlived their relevance in a globalized world, or that they inevitably collapse into authoritarianism. Along the way, we will recall two vivid anecdotes: the 1956 Khrushchev secret speech that shattered the myth of Leninist purity, and the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union that reopened the debate about the viability of Lenin's project. And we will constantly refer back to the three pillars we examined earlier: the Leninist conception of the state, the role of the vanguard party, and the ethical framework that undergirded the revolutionary subject. In doing so, we hope to illuminate how each component feeds into the broader legacy, and why the story of Lenin remains, paradoxically, both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. Let us begin with the first major reinterpretation of Lenin's thought, the one that emerged under Joseph Stalin in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Stalin, a man who had risen through the ranks of the Bolshevik apparatus precisely because of his organizational skill, presented himself as the faithful executor of Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat. Yet the way he read Lenin was profoundly selective. In a series of articles and speeches, Stalin emphasized the passages in State and Revolution that spoke of the necessity of a centralized, disciplined, and unified party, while downplaying Lenin's warnings about the dangers of bureaucratization. He argued that Lenin's insistence on the need for a revolutionary vanguard implied a permanent hierarchy, a view that justified the creation of a monolithic party apparatus that could direct every aspect of economic and social life. As Stalin famously declared in 1931, "We are not merely following Lenin's line, we are completing it." This claim was not merely rhetorical. The institutional reforms he instituted, collectivization of agriculture, the rapid industrial five-year plans, the establishment of the Council of People's Commissars as a central executive body, were all presented as the logical fulfillment of Lenin's vision of a dictatorship of the proletariat that would crush the remnants of bourgeois power. Stalin's reinterpretation also had a profound impact on the Leninist conception of the state. Earlier, we discussed how Lenin saw the state as a tool of class domination, a machine for the oppression of one class by another. He argued that after the proletariat seized power, the state would wither away, giving way to a stateless communist society. Stalin, however, reframed this notion of withering away as a temporary retreat, a necessary step before the state could become the instrument of the people's will. In his 1935 speech to the Party Congress, Stalin proclaimed, "The state is not a temporary evil, but a permanent instrument of the working class until the final triumph of socialism." This inversion of Lenin's original intention had far-reaching consequences. It provided an ideological justification for the centralization of power, for the suppression of dissent within the party, and for the creation of a security apparatus that would later be known as the NKVD and eventually the KGB. The Stalinist reading of Lenin also set the stage for the first major theoretical divergence, Leon Trotsky's doctrine of permanent revolution. Trotsky, a close comrade of Lenin and the architect of the Red Army, grew increasingly uneasy with the direction Stalin was taking the Soviet Union. In his 1930 work, The Permanent Revolution, Trotsky argued that Lenin's notion of a transitional state was being betrayed by Stalin's bureaucratic ossification. Trotsky insisted that the proletarian revolution could not be confined within the borders of a single nation. Rather, it required an ongoing, international process that would prevent the emergence of a degenerated worker state. He wrote, "The revolution is not a one-time event, but a continuous struggle that must break through the walls of national isolation." For Trotsky, the vanguard party must remain a dynamic, self-critical organism, constantly renewing itself through democratic centralism, not through the rigid top-down hierarchy that Stalin had instituted. Trotsky's critique was not merely a personal quarrel. It represented a deeper philosophical contest over the nature of the revolutionary subject and the role of the party. Whereas Stalin emphasized the party as a monolithic leadership that could command the masses, Trotsky returned to Lenin's earlier insistence that the party must be a school of the proletariat, a place where the working class could develop its own consciousness through debate and struggle. In this sense, Trotsky's permanent revolution can be read as an attempt to rescue Lenin's ethical commitment to the empowerment of the proletariat from the authoritarian drift that Stalin had introduced. Trotsky's ideas would later inspire a series of Fourth International movements that sought to keep alive a Leninist tradition untainted by Stalinist bureaucracy. Moving beyond the Soviet Union, the Western Marxist tradition offered its own set of reinterpretations and critiques. Georg, writing in the 1930s, engaged Lenin's ideas through the lens of class consciousness and reification. In his seminal work History and Class Consciousness, Lukács argued that Lenin's emphasis on a disciplined vanguard risked turning the party into a new class that could reify the very relations it sought to abolish. He warned that the party, if it ceases to be a vehicle of the masses and becomes a self-propagating entity, reproduces the alienation it pretends to overcome. This critique resonated with the earlier concerns raised by Trotsky, but Lukács went further by situating the problem within the broader cultural and epistemological structures of capitalist society. He suggested that Lenin's failure to fully address the totality of capitalist ideology left a gap that could be filled by bureaucratic domination. Louis Althusser, a French structuralist Marxist of the 1960s and 1970s, offered yet another angle. In his essay Lenin and Philosophy, Althusser praised Lenin for his theoretical practice, that is, his ability to fuse theory and action in a way that transcended the philosophical abstraction of earlier Marxist thought. Yet Althusser also cautioned that Lenin's theory of the party functioned as an ideological state apparatus that could become a site of interpolation, whereby individuals are hailed as subjects of the party's ideology, thereby losing their capacity for autonomous critique. Althusser famously wrote, "The party is both the instrument of the revolution and the medium through which the revolutionary subject is constituted." This paradoxical insight underscores the double-edged nature of Leninist organization. It is simultaneously the engine of transformation and the potential source of domination. These Western critiques did not merely remain academic exercises, they informed the praxis of numerous left-wing movements throughout the Cold War. The New Left of the 1960s, for instance, grappled with the tension between the need for disciplined organization and the desire for participatory democracy. The student movements in France, Germany, and the United States often invoked Lenin's democratic centralism as a model for creating cohesive action, while at the same time rejecting the authoritarian outcomes that Stalinist regimes had produced. In this sense, the legacy of Lenin's philosophy became a contested field where activists negotiated the balance between structure and spontaneity, between authority and emancipation. Now let us bring the discussion into the contemporary moment. One clear example of Leninist organizational principles in action can be found in the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA. Although the DSA operates within the framework of a liberal democracy, its internal governance borrows heavily from Leninist concepts of democratic centralism and a disciplined cadre. The organization's national committee, for instance, functions as a central organ that sets strategic priorities, while local chapters are expected to align their actions with these directives. In practice, this means that DSA members engage in regular political education sessions, reminiscent of the Bolshevik party schools, where theory is linked directly to current campaigns, whether it is the fight for Medicare for all, the push for a Green New Deal, or the struggle against corporate influence in elections. As a DSA spokesperson told a reporter in 2022, "We need a clear, unified line on key issues. Otherwise, we risk being co-opted by the very system we aim to transform." The emphasis on a unified line echoes Lenin's insistence that the party must be a single, organized body, capable of acting with one voice. A second modern illustration comes from anti-imperialist movements in the Global South that have revived Leninist rhetoric to challenge contemporary forms of neocolonial domination. In 2020, a coalition of left-wing activists in Venezuela, Bolivia, and parts of Central America issued a joint declaration that explicitly invoked Lenin's call for the overthrow of imperialist exploitation. The document referred to the necessity of a disciplined revolutionary vanguard to coordinate the struggle against multinational corporations and the military interventions of imperial powers. While these movements differ dramatically in their local contexts, they share a common belief that only a tightly organized, theoretically grounded force can confront the asymmetrical power of global capital. In the words of a Bolivian activist, without the Leninist principle of a unified front, our protests become fragmented and easily neutralized. These contemporary uses of Leninist ideas are not without controversy. Post-colonial theorists such as Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak and Homi K. Babha have argued that Lenin's framework is fundamentally Eurocentric, rooted in the industrial conditions of early 20th century Russia, and therefore ill-suited to address the complexities of a globalized world marked by transnational capital, digital communication, and hybrid identities. Spivak, in a 2018 essay, questioned whether the notion of a universal proletariat, as articulated by Lenin, can survive the pluralities of post-colonial subjectivities. She contended that the universalist language of class struggle often erases the specific histories of colonized peoples, reducing their struggles to a single, monolithic category. From this perspective, Lenin's emphasis on a centralized vanguard risks reproducing a form of intellectual colonialism, where a small elite claims to speak for the masses across disparate cultural contexts. A second line of critique comes from scholars and activists who argue that Lenin's philosophy, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably leads to authoritarian outcomes. The argument proceeds in three stages. First, the centralization of political power in a single party creates a structural predisposition toward the suppression of dissent. Second, the Leninist ethic of the end justifies the means provides moral cover for violent repression, as Lenin himself wrote in What Is to Be Done, that the revolutionary must be prepared to use any means necessary to achieve the revolution. Third, once the party assumes the role of the state of the proletariat, it becomes difficult to reverse the concentration of authority without risking chaos. Critics such as Hannah Arendt have emphasized that the totalitarian nature of a one-party system lies not in its ideology, but in its structural capacity to mobilize and control every aspect of social life. In the wake of the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, this critique gained renewed urgency. The collapse of the USSR was not merely an economic failure, it was also a profound ideological rupture that forced scholars to confront the question, could a Leninist state ever avoid devolving into bureaucratic despotism? The 1991 disintegration of the Soviet Union indeed sparked a flood of scholarly debate. In the immediate aftermath, a group of Russian intellectuals, including former dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, argued that Lenin's vanguard had become a self-preserving bureaucracy that had betrayed the revolutionary ideals it claimed to uphold. Solzhenitsyn famously wrote, "What began as a promise of emancipation turned into a new form of slavery, because the party replaced the Tsar as the master of the people." Conversely, some Marxist scholars, such as Ernest Mandel, contended that the Soviet collapse was not a failure of Leninist theory per se, but rather a distortion caused by the abandonment of democratic principles within the party. Mandel argued that if the party had remained true to Lenin's insistence on internal criticism and mass participation, the degeneration into a bureaucratic caste could have been avoided. This debate illustrates how the legacy of Lenin continues to be a contested terrain, with each side invoking different aspects of his writings to support their claims. In the same vein, the 1956 Khrushchev secret speech provides a vivid anecdote that underscores the internal contradictions of the Leninist tradition. At the 20th Party Congress, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a closed-door address that denounced the cult of personality surrounding Joseph Stalin and exposed the excesses of the Stalinist period. In his speech, Khrushchev invoked Lenin as a benchmark, stating, "Lenin was a great leader, but he was not a tyrant. The perversions of his doctrine were the result of bureaucratic degeneration." This speech was a watershed moment. It opened the possibility that Lenin's ideas could be reclaimed from the Stalinist distortion and reinterpreted in a more humane direction. Yet it also revealed a paradox. Khrushchev used Lenin's authority to legitimize his own critique of Stalin, thereby reinforcing the very centralization of power that Lenin had originally advocated. The secret speech thus becomes a microcosm of the broader tension between Lenin's revolutionary ideals and the ways in which they have been co-opted to justify authoritarian practices. Returning to the three pillars we explored earlier, the Leninist state, the vanguard party, and the ethics of revolutionary subjectivity, we can see how each has been reimagined, contested, and repurposed over time. The Leninist state, originally conceived as a temporary instrument for the suppression of the bourgeoisie, was transformed under Stalin into a permanent, bureaucratic apparatus. Trotsky's permanent revolution attempted to reinfuse the state with a sense of continuous struggle, emphasizing that the state must remain thin and responsive to the masses. In contemporary left-wing parties, the state is often approached as a terrain of struggle rather than a fixed structure. Campaigns focus on building power from below, while still recognizing the need for a disciplined organizational core. The vanguard party, which Lenin described as the educational and organizational nucleus of the proletariat, has been variously interpreted as a rigid hierarchy, a democratic collective, or a networked coalition. In the DSA, for instance, the party functions as a political cadre that coordinates actions across multiple fronts. Yet it also encourages grassroots assemblies that echo Lenin's early emphasis on mass participation. Finally, the ethical dimension, Lenin's insistence on the moral responsibility of the revolutionary subject to act in accordance with the interests of the working class, continues to be a point of friction. Post-colonial critiques argue that this ethics is too universalist, while Trotsky and Althusser remind us that the ethical formation of the subject must be an ongoing, self-critical process, not a static proclamation of loyalty. What does this mean for contemporary relevance? To answer that, we might ask, can Lenin's insights be stripped of their historical baggage and applied to the challenges of a world shaped by digital surveillance, climate crisis, and transnational capitalism? Some scholars argue affirmatively. They point to Lenin's methodological principle of the party as a laboratory of practice, wherein theory is constantly tested against concrete conditions. In the age of social media, this principle could translate into digital collectives that experiment with new forms of participatory decision-making, using open-source platforms to coordinate actions while maintaining a clear strategic line. Others, however, caution that the very logic of centralization that made the Bolshevik Party effective in 1917 also makes it vulnerable to co-option by corporate interests in the digital age. The risk, they argue, is that the vanguard becomes a technocratic elite that speaks for the masses without truly being accountable to them. Consider, for a moment, the analogy of a ship navigating a stormy sea. Lenin's vanguard party can be likened to the captain and crew who know the ship's design, the currents, and the weather patterns. Their expertise allows the vessel to cut through the waves with purpose. Yet if the captain becomes a tyrant, imposing his will without listening to the crew, the ship may run aground or the crew may mutiny. Conversely, if the crew is left to drift without any coordination, the ship may be tossed about, never reaching its destination. The challenge, then, is to find a balance where the captain and crew share authority, where the captain's decisions are informed by the crew's experience, and where the ship's course reflects a collective vision. This balance is precisely the tension at the heart of Leninist organization, a tension that has played out in the Soviet experiment, in Trotsky's critique, in the Western academic debates, and in the contemporary movements we have just described. Historical anecdotes further illuminate this tension. The first, as mentioned, is Khrushchev's secret speech. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin's excesses, he did so by invoking Lenin's name as a moral compass, thereby attempting